Okay, if you were looking for this video and wanted to know how I made the interior of this clock, then let's jump right into it. Almost everything seen in the interior is wood, so let's get cutting. So for starters, the small area above the clock face is the moon dial. This clock's moon dial is a small house with Harry flying over the field. In order to replicate this, I would simply use a picture, so I needed a backing for it. I took some leftover 1/4-inch MDF and simply drew out the arch directly onto it. I wanted the picture to be a little set back into the moon dial, so I took a piece of birch and traced it out as well. To give the arch the setback appearance without it being visible, I added about 1/4 inch all the way around my arch, on the birch. This would keep the spacer from being visible when looking at the moon dial. While I was at it, I took a measurement for the size of the picture I would need. I simply wrote it right on the piece so I would not forget it. Next we are going to cut out the spacer. I took the spacer, which is the birch piece, and took it to the bandsaw and simply cut out my arch. Once your spacer is cut, you can glue it to your MDF. Simply put a little glue down and clamp into position. Ensure you use your arch to stay aligned. I took a small piece of stem wire and unclamped a portion of the moon dial backboard, slid the wire into position and clamped it back down. In my head, this would be used to allow Harry to hover over and out of the picture while on his broom. So cut the stem wire long at this point. You can trim it down to fit it once you have Harry attached. Take it outside and paint the spacer area black. There is no need to paint anything but the side portions of the spacer. I found a photo on the internet and took it into Photoshop. Here I removed Harry from the picture and saved him individually. Then I printed both the backdrop and Harry by himself. I printed the picture to the dimensions that I had written down earlier and then just trimmed them up a bit to get a perfect fit. With Harry, I took some scissors and trimmed him down a bit. Then, with an X-Acto knife, I cut him free from the white backdrop. Using Elmer's glue, I simply glued the picture to the moon dial area. Then I took Harry and positioned him into what I thought was a good spot, and then I pulled him off and then trimmed the wire. From there, I cut a small piece of duct tape, cut it even smaller so it wouldn't be shown outside of his body, and placed it on the back of the wire, and then stuck Harry right onto the wire, allowing the tape to hold him into place onto the wire. From there, glue your moon dial into place and clamp down until it's dry. Now it looks a little recessed and Harry seems to be hovering over it all. It was at this point that the yellow top portion flare finished drying. So I took these two little yellow circles and glued them into position. They were actually made during the other video. With the top complete, I moved on to the center box. I grabbed a piece of paper and drew out my first pendulum. I took a scrap piece of pine and cut a very thin slice off of it. This would be the rod for the weight. And while I was at it, I cut another piece for the pendulum that sits beside that one as well. For the large center pendulum, I simply used a roll of tape and traced it out. For the apple-shaped pendulum that my paper drawing represented, it wasn't really helping me much, so I started with a circle and then I tried to transform it more into the shape that it was, which closely resembled an apple. Okay, the more I looked at my drawing, the more I thought it looked awful. So I went back to my paper, drew it out one more time, and then cut it out. Then folded it in half and trimmed away anything that didn't match. This was to ensure it was symmetrical. Then I used the cutout piece of paper to trace it onto the board. And that's the piece I went with. Once cut out, I was pleased with its shape. I then put a coat of gloss white on both and let it sit to dry. So while working on these pieces, I was throwing around in my head how to attach them to the inside of the box. And while I was walking through Home Depot, I saw a piece of grate. Not sure exactly what it was. I think it's the grate stuff that they use to cover your rain spouts on your roof to keep the leaves out. Anyway, it was really cheap, and in my head I thought this would be a perfect item to push up into the top of each box, and then with all its holes, it would allow me to use hooks to hang anything and move them at ease if I did not like their positions. I simply used some clamps and a small piece of wood to make my bends. Then, leaving the edges slightly bent, I would shove it up, and its own bend would hold it into position up in each box. My first attempt at this worked great, so I made one for the bottom box as well. Once my white primer was done, I went ahead and spray painted each pendulum with gold paint, and then with a paintbrush I simply streaked up the larger pendulum. For all the little detail on the first rod, I simply cut out all the pieces from the leftover birch, then painted them gold and drilled small holes in the center of each. With a dab of superglue and small brad nails, I pushed them through the holes, attached them all together, and simply bent each brad on the back to help them hold into position. Now the weight was attached to the rod by a Y-looking piece, so I drew out and cut out, then painted one more piece, and simply used it to glue and hold the two pieces together. The next piece looked like a pulley, so I cut 3 circles and made one slightly smaller than the other two, and then just simply glued them all together. The next 2 pieces move us to the bottom box, where I simply cut a dowel into 2 pieces at about 5 inches each. These would be for the lower box counterweights. To make these fancy, I would simply cut some small circles out of the 1/4 inch MDF and glue them on the top and the bottom of each rod. I'm trying to keep this simple for a do-it-yourselfer. Originally I was going to make these on a lathe, but I did not want to waste any more time than I needed to. Going back to my very first pendulum, I removed my clamp, everything was dry, and I guess it was ready to hang. Going back to my pulley, I took some leftover banister, painted it gold, and then used the same pine to attach the pulley. This actually looked better than I thought it would. I drilled a pilot hole in the side of each, and then I tapped in a brad. I was actually afraid of cracking or splitting the small pieces, and I'd spent too much time painting them. That's why I drilled in the pilot holes before I did this. To get the pulley to hold the counterweight, I put a small block on the top of the weight, the same width as my extended pieces, and then I tapped it in with a brad. Then I put a small dab of glue on each side and held it in position with a small clamp until the glue dried. I actually thought this looked pretty damn cool for being all wood. Who would have guessed? From there I simply drilled holes at the top of each rod, put in a bent paper clip, and hooked them each into my grate. For the pulley string, I took some brown loafer shoelaces and cut them to size. I chose these because the shoelaces already look kind of gold and I wouldn't need to paint them or do anything else to them. Once tied, I took a paper clip, bent it into the loafer shoestring, and then I hung it from the grate. The black background in each box really makes the gold pop. The last 2 pieces in the lower portion of the box were the easiest. I simply took 2 thin dowels, shaved the ends to make them flat, took a hole saw and cut 2 larger round circles, painted them gold, and then glued the flat edges of each dowel to the back of each circle. I would then overlap them and glue the circles together. I cut a few extra circles and then glued them together for something for the small dowels to stick into and allow me to hang my paper clip into it so I could hang it from the grate as well. To give the chain appearance of the 2 lower counterweights, I simply used some small chain. I honestly can't tell you what this chain is from, but I simply cut one piece to hold both weights, but I used 2 paper clips to keep them separated from each other. I did not bother to attempt to paint these chains. It was small enough, and I don't think anyone will notice or not if it's not gold. Now that my lower pendulums were dry, I cut the ends off and drilled in a hole on the top so I could feed some stem wire through. This would allow me to hang it and be done. But I felt that I had completely made them look like crap while drilling and clamping. So then I went back and lightly sanded them again and put a fresh coat of gold on them. And because I was so impatient, as this was the finishing touch, I pulled out a hairdryer and blow dried the finishing pieces. With this piece done, I hung them and called this project complete. If you watched this far, I want to thank you and call you a true Harry Potter fan. Don't forget to leave a comment below, because I respond to all comments. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.